Hello, everyone. Very excited that we're all able to be here. We'll just allow for whoever joins to join when they do. There we go. Just so you know who you're speaking to and you can see the face. For those who are new here, my name is Michelle, and I am going to be co-hosting the space with Kulu Nkasela, who will come up maybe now, maybe later on. There they are. We are the ACA education team, and today we have very, very special guests that are going to be joining us. Now, if you were not in the Monday session, we were speaking about what are alternative climate solutions and how they fit into our context being the African context. And we had so many people sharing their experiences. We had so many people sharing what they think are alternative climate solutions, obviously alternative to whatever has been offered already. And so what we do is on Mondays, we have what we call back to basic workshops. And on the Wednesday, we then have these dialogues that I'm so excited that you all joined, where we speak to people who are in the social justice space. Could be people who are activists themselves. It could be people who engage in these different social justice spaces in very different ways. And I don't want to say too much for fear that I might say everything that is there to say about the two people that are joining us today. So we've got Tala Booth and we've got Zahir Suleiman, who will be joining us to have this conversation around today's topic, talking about the takeaways from international conferences, because they've both been at international conferences, and in their view, what actually makes a climate solution. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritties of everything, I do want to invite everyone to please be on mute and please stay on mute. That's just so we can all hear each other. That's so we don't interrupt the panelists when they are sharing. So I'll give that moment because I do still hear an echo on my end. And I think that could be someone's mic being on. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page. All right, wonderful. Now, as I said earlier, we have two very special guests today, and they are Tala Booth from South Africa and Zahir Suleiman from South Africa as well. What I'll do now, since I've given a small little introduction, I often don't like to introduce people myself because I feel like people often do themselves justice when they speak about themselves and the work that they do. So Tyler, I'm going to come to you and just ask you to please introduce yourself. So who are you? What do you do? Why do you do the things that you do? What would you want us to know about you? Wow us.
Michelle, that's a loaded question to try achieve in a couple short minutes, but hopefully through the conversation this evening, I can hopefully do that some justice and really wow you. Thanks, Zahir. So hi everyone. So I think maybe getting to where I've come from and the journey where I've been and why I can be someone who talks about this topic is I started off my youth climate activism journey back in about 2016, maybe even a little bit earlier if you count some of the research work that went on behind that. And that was mainly through the Youth at SCIA's Youth Policy Committee and the Model UN programs and environmental sustainability research projects. So they started up in that, then realized, oh, wow, this policy thing, it's difficult, but it's super interesting. Like, how do I engage with that? How do I look at that at a national level? How do I look at that at an international level? Like, how do I fit in? And like, knowing that there's people that don't, that youth voices aren't necessarily represented in this space. how do I, one, insert myself in that space, and two, how do I get other young people into that space with me? So it's not me as one voice standing up and speaking out. It's a group of us standing up and saying, hey, we don't agree with this. Hey, we think this should happen. That should happen. So that's kind of where I started. And then during the COVID years, I worked on the Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan that we did with the city of Johannesburg, and WITS and the Global Change Institute and Youth at SIRE, where we really led this process and created something that hasn't been done before, where young people were able to give not only just an input on a climate policy, but wrote a section on the Johannesburg Climate Action Plan. So if you go look in their section under mobilizing stakeholders, you can find our work there. And that was then a building block for the work that we did on the South African Youth Climate Action Plan that we did through 2021, and launched in October that year. But along the way, there was quite a number of conferences. In 2019, I was able to join the COP25 with the South African delegation as a youth delegate, and once again at COP26 with the delegation, as I was studying in the UK. And currently, I'm working for Friends of the Earth International in their Climate Justice and Energy Program, as a very long job title, Climate International Program Coordinator, for CJE issues. And most of my focus at the moment is on the just transition, bringing in the feminist angle to the just transition, and also linking into renewable work and making sure that the way we're going about doing renewables and implementing and scaling up and doing the scale and speed aspect of implementing renewables is that it's really just centers on people and actually advances access issues, or improves access, and really rooted in justice principles.
So I'll tell you one thing, you've definitely wowed us. So thank you for that, and being very detailed. I think it also helps us to understand the type of people, or the type of person, rather in your case, that we're going to be engaging with, and just kind of your experiences. Because I mean, when we speak about international conferences and you having attended several of them and having even been at an international university, I think it's going to be very interesting having this conversation. So thank you for that. Thank you for that very, very detailed introduction to yourself. And this is why I say I can never do justice to introducing people. And with that, I'd like to come to you, Zahir, and ask you to do the same thing. Please, would you please wow us? What do you do? Why do you do it? Who are you? Yeah, I mean, everything.
Yeah, hi everyone. I don't think I can compete much to Tyler, given that she has also been like my own role model and inspiration. And we always make the joke that I always say that Tyler is so advanced. Like, how do I become Tyler? But yeah, I have a little bit of a different yet also similar story, in the sense that I started in policy work and having a big and deep interest for global affairs, and specifically in climate work and climate research. And that sort of came to fruition when I was working with the Youth Policy Committee for the South African Institute of International Affairs, and specifically in the Climate Change Working Group. My interest in the space actually stemmed from being a Model UN delegate, and having competed in Model UN, realized, oh, I actually really like this. And what started off as an extracurricular activity really became a deep passion for change and for activism. And that really cemented my journey as a climate activist, wanting to create like some positive change and wanting to spread that mission to everywhere else and make it as accessible as possible. One thing about me is in an sort of uncanny or non-traditional way, I actually decided to enter this space from a digital arts, specifically a game design and animation perspective. So I am a student at the University of Witwatersrand. I'm currently a final year, where I'm majoring in digital arts. And my hope is to sort of combine that creativity and that interest in new mediums and new technologies and bring that into the climate space. So yeah, I mean, I still have a very deep love and passion for policy, looking where the commas go, looking where the formatting and structure goes. But I really want to, the way that I sort of cement myself in the space is wanting to bring that into newer mediums and take that forward. I suppose with all of my luck, and with all of the luck and opportunity and the hard work, I was able to similarly work on the Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan during COVID, and then subsequently take that further into the South African Youth Climate Action Plan as an art and digital media lead. So really bringing my two fields together and combining it in a way that I was never able to do so before. And yeah, I think with that, I was able to join the South African delegation, similar to Tyler, for COP27 and COP28 as a junior delegate, to be able to assist the delegation and follow some of the negotiation tracks. My Model UN has not left me. I'm still a very big Model UN fan, and I'm fortunate enough to work with an organization known as Immuna, which hosts large Model UN conferences in New York. In fact, I told the people at African Climate Alliance that you caught me on the right day, because my plane takes off tomorrow. I'm literally leaving tomorrow. So you caught me on the right day. My suitcase is there in the corner. But yeah, I mean, with all of that said, that's sort of who I am. That's my goals. I really want to bring education and climate education and accessibility to everyone, and especially through like new and more creative mediums like games and animation, and bring that policy space in.
I'm wowed all over again. Honestly, truly, and I'm not just saying this for many different reasons, including catching you on the right day, but also what better panel to have this discussion with rather than the people who have been such pioneers in the space. And I think that's always interesting. Sometimes when you hear people speak about policy, it's very easy, or it has been very easy for me to not link it with international conferences. And so I've always thought about it from a local perspective, and just hearing about some of your experiences in the international space with policy and how kind of you getting involved with policy led you to then, these spaces is very interesting to me. And I think in some ways even inspiring, because then I know I can do it too. And I think many people in the space, just hearing you guys speak and like the trajectory of your careers thus far, it's very realistic. And that's not always something that you feel when you speak to climate activists. It's always someone who's been doing like this amazing work, which you guys are, but sometimes it feels out of touch. So thank you for those really, really awesome introductions. It really sets the scene for the conversation then that we are going to speak about, because we want to, eventually, at the end of the conversation, we obviously want to understand what some of your takeaways from these international conferences that you've been a part of have been, and maybe even the most recent ones, COP28 and the one before that, and all the other ones. I always see on Tala, your statuses, you're like at some conference. So like all of these takeaways from all of these conferences, and ultimately what makes a viable climate solution in your view. So that's essentially where the conversation is going, and where we hope we end up just understanding that, especially from an African context. But now that we know a little bit about yourselves and how you got into the work that you do, I want to start with asking what can be seen as a controversial question. And the question is, do you believe that international conferences, like COP specifically, are relevant to the issues that people are faced with? Knowing that both of you have had your feet on the ground before you went into the international arena. So I think I'll start with you, Zahir. Do you think that international conferences are relevant to the issues that people are faced with? And also just maybe for the people in the room, if you can just tell us just briefly what COP is and why it happens.
Yeah, a very controversial question, 100%. And I love these sort of questions. So for those that do not know, COP stands for the Conference of Parties. It is under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it is basically the annual conference on climate action and climate policy, where governments around the world, including observers as well as climate activists, everyone gathers to further climate action and to further progress in our goals of trying to keep global warming limited. It is the biggest United Nations conference. with its own pros and cons and has a lot of caveats attached to it. But I think from my perspective on if it is relevant or not, I think it's a yes and no. Specifically coming from on the ground, having worked in that landscape of like being in the Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan, working in policy like more on the national and local level, COP is a very big, very bureaucratic event that features a lot of high-level talk. It features a lot of, we say we're going to do things, we say we're going to do things, we say we're going to do things, we're going to put it in a policy. And sometimes those are achieved, sometimes those are not. And what it does is it creates that sort of disconnect and distance from on the ground work versus from a high level governmental perspective. So I think that's, everybody has that sort of impression and perspective. Oh, it's the United Nations. Like, what are they really doing? But on the other hand, having stepped foot at these conferences, for those that are fortunate enough to attend, COP is a perfect place to unite policymaker and on-the-ground activist. And it is probably one of the only places in the world where you can have an audience with the exact people that you need to be having an audience with, where you as a hometown small climate activist, fighting for action in your hometown, fighting for action in your city, fighting for climate action, with any small feat that you might be doing, it is the perfect place to be able to get that audience that you want and that you're looking for and connect the storyteller that you are, connect the activist that you are to those bigger and larger audiences, such as government workers, officials of the United Nations, or anyone that might have funding or might be able to bring those network and opportunities to you. So there comes with a yes and no. Yes, because it is relevant and it allows these small issues to, and larger issues, in fact, and the more, I'm losing the word, but the more unseen issues that are prevalent that we say that government might not notice or might not have to struggle with, those are able to get brought up at COP, and they're able to get given the attention that they deserve and that they need. But it is balanced with the fact that we are looking at 193 countries, all of whom disagree on how they should achieve things, all of them who agree on a climate policy, but will have different ways of implementation, and sometimes sign a policy for signing a policy's sake, sometimes really meaning that implementation. So that there really is that balance. And I think it's okay that the answer doesn't have to have a specific end to that. And I think it's a continuous and growing issue. And every year COP gets more activists and more on the ground issues that are brought up with it. And I think it's lovely to see that develop. But, with each thing, there comes that grain of salt that we have to take into account.
Oh, and I mean, that's very interesting because I also am of a controversial stance. I have to confess, a part of me was like, are they still relevant? Maybe not. Actually, maybe we should scrape them altogether. But now I'm like, hang on, if we do away with them completely, with the view that you've offered now, then we lose a platform where all these activists can connect, but can also connect their activism to the policy and maybe even influence a lot of the ways that we do things from an international lens. And so that becomes very interesting. So I want to be the first to admit that maybe might change. And with that, I think that obviously, when we speak about these conversations around climate change, climate issues, it's also a conversation around issues of justice. And sometimes, especially if you're a spectator, like I see in the comments, someone is talking about how they've always participated online. I mean, I've gone as far as participating back on social media and maybe watching things happen and unfold. So not quite being there and probably not quite being as engaged as could be. And I guess my question then, or the curiosity around that for me, would be around justice specifically. Is this a platform, or are these platforms not just COPs or these international conferences? And this is where I'm going to rope you in, Tyler, here. Are these platforms that you feel like are effective in maybe tackling or even just having discussions on issues around justice? So be it social justice, economic justice, climate justice, whatever that might look like. Do you feel like they are platforms that do this adequately? Why, if yes, why not, if no? The floor is yours.
Thanks, Michelle. And yeah, great answers here to the previous question. I think maybe also reflecting on it is maybe like the addition of, and how it leads into this question, is when you look at the COP conference, and the main reason I think NGOs still see it as a valid space to exist in and to attend and to legitimize by attending in like the 90,000 sort of numbers, is because it's still the only place where every government is supposedly at an equal footing. So in theory, everyone has an equal vote, has an equal say. But in practice, that's not necessarily the case. There's lots of dynamics internationally. And so you kind of go to the power dynamics and geopolitics of climate change and how those affect the justice aspects. And then on your question, the justice also has various different levels. So in that international space, there is an element that international justice is at play, in that everyone is in the room at the same time. Maybe not necessarily if you're following specific negotiations, but every country has the right to be present in the room. And that is very powerful in making sure that all the voices are heard. But then you kind of have to take it back a step, in that once governments are represented, are they really representing the people on the ground and the people experiencing the issues? And sometimes that's not always something that you're seeing. We see, like, especially African countries, the governments are quite underfunded and undersupported, in the capacity to actually attend COP and be following every single item that is being negotiated isn't there and what it needs to be, compared to what, say, the EU brings. They have massive delegations and massive support and massive people that can support things, and one person or even two people can follow one item, say the adaptation work. And then you have, say, Africa, where one negotiator will be following gender, ACE, capacity building, which here is done. You'll have another one following adaptation, global stocktake, and, like, say, the just transition, all really big items. So in terms of bringing that justice up the levels and bringing those perspectives up, that's not there. But then when you talk about, is it a platform for justice? It's again a yes and no answer. Is that in the COP is an incredibly hypocritical space. Like, you've got one of the organizations and one of the networks that operate around COP releases a report every year detailing how many people from the fossil fuel industry are engaged in these events. And once again, last year, the COP28 was a new record number of fossil fuel lobbyists joining the COP and doing work on the sidelines. You also had the information from the just before that the UAE was doing business, and various countries were doing business with oil companies and planning to do that inside the COP venue, which is incredibly hypocritical. But then when you talk about bringing it back to the justice aspect, and are these conferences actually made for that and built for that? The answer is simply no. It was built on a system that is incredibly unequal. There's huge divides on the power of the people in the room, largely because of other things. It's quite complicated. It's quite a complicated answer in bringing social justice, economic justice, climate justice, because we can't really have climate justice without economic justice. So we can see Africa pushing for financial system reform, because there's a lot of countries in the world that have significant debt that they can't pay for. And now they're being told, well, yes, you need to do these climate change things, you need to do mitigation, but the only way you can get support for it is by incurring more debt. Or the only way you can get that support in the first place is if you extract your resources. So whether it's going to be you extract more oil and gas and therefore not actually commit to your Paris Agreement goals, or whether you're extracting your critical minerals or transition minerals so that you can actually guarantee and pay back the loans. So there's this international system operating on the sidelines that doesn't get brought in and called out in the negotiation rooms, because governments go into the negotiation rooms as a government. They're not going to call out the things they're doing wrong in the country. They're going to highlight what they're doing right, and they're going to try work to their vision of what they want the world to be and how they can get the most bang for their buck. But then at the same time, it is a space for justice because there's so much more that happens outside the room of COP. So you have press conferences, you have side events, you have actions, you have the people you meet in random alleyways that, I mean, there's an example, I'm sure many of you know Sibusiso. The one day at COP28, there was a whole bunch of ministers and like prime ministers and presidents walking around. And there's this video of Sibusiso standing behind William Ruto going. So, I mean, the chances you have of bumping into people that you can effect change with and effect justice is quite strong. And then I think maybe, I know my answer's been a bit all over the place because it's not an easy answer. I mean, you can write a whole dissertation on this, is that experience of inside and outside the room in COP. So when you talk about participating, and I saw there was a question coming through, how do you best participate? Well, it depends what you want to achieve and how you want to interact with the space. Because yes, engaging in the policy and engaging with the policymakers and having bilaterals and talking to the negotiators is a way to effect change. It might not get you very far for some negotiators because they're very set, they have their bottom lines, this is what they're negotiating with. But then there's also the outside the room stuff that the media actually grabs onto and will propel these. So when you do an action outside, when you do a protest outside the negotiating rooms, that's really going to draw attention. And that's a good way to bring in these conversations of justice, of social justice, economic justice, climate justice, food justice, all that kind of gender justice as well, all those layers. You can bring them in. And sorry, what I was starting to say earlier is my experience at COP26. It was very much an inside-outside COP, but it was slightly different. The COPs that followed after that were Egypt, UAE, and now we're going to Azerbaijan. All are in quite repressive regimes. We're protesting, and an external civil society body in the country isn't quite allowed to speak up and speak out, and when they do, there is an attack on earth and human rights defenders, or there's wrongful imprisonment and that sort of thing. But what we saw at COP26, it was it is a country that allowed that outside protest, and you saw people mobilize in the numbers, and you saw people presenting as the theme of this conversation, those real solutions outside the room and talking about it and navigating those conversations and coming together and being, we might not agree on this, like some specifics, but we do agree we need to change the way the system is working. But then at the same time, on the inside, literally, as Zahir said, he's happy to argue about a comma. I experienced that in the negotiation rooms. We argued for 30 minutes about should a comma be there or should a comma not be there. So it kind of, sometimes the justice isn't there in the room when you're there, and it's hard to see the way out. I think if you ever are able to attend a COP in person, it's going to be very depressing and it's going to be very sobering, realizing how unjust everything is and how, while we might be fighting with the South African government, like in the ACA is fighting on the Council Coal case, the government's also fighting a larger international dynamic that both they could be doing better, and they can't use the argument of, well, others have polluted more, so we don't need to do anything. But at the same time, they're fighting a system that has backed Africa and the global South into a corner and not given them any power to actually make a change. There's so many other rules and hierarchies and things that happen and new policies emerging that force us into that colonial and neo-colonial thing of, we have the resources, but we don't have the money, you have the money, and the only way we can make money is by giving you our resources. So, sorry, very complicated and long answer, but the issues are so broad when you're talking about climate justice and what's actually discussed in the room that sometimes it feels like it's failing you and you're not getting anywhere, but then you see people in the outside of the room talking about the real solutions, the work they're actually doing, the projects they're actually implementing, the people they're actually affecting, and you do get some more hope once again.
Yeah, and one highlight while you were speaking about all of this, which might not necessarily be very relevant, was when you spoke about how COP can actually be, and Zahir having been there, was enthusiastically hosting, like, yes, absolutely, that's a very real experience. And I was like, okay, cool, that's very interesting, because this is a little bit contrasting. But I think that in some ways answers the question. And like you said, it's a layered question, right? I mean, what do we even mean by justice? And when we speak about climate justice, what exactly are we speaking about? Are we talking about it from an adaptation sense? Are we speaking about it from a people first? And when we say people first, what do we actually mean? Are we saying people need access to education, water, resources? Are we saying that to prioritize a people of a country, we need to stop this exchange between getting money for the resources that we have? And when we say resources, are we actually speaking about fossil fuels? Because that recently also came up where all of these countries were like, well, actually, Africa needs to continue to rely on fossil fuels and maybe gas and maybe this and maybe that, which then becomes in some ways contradictory to people who are sitting on the sidelines, particularly ACA, literally in court fighting the government against new coal. And then them saying, actually, coal and other fossil fuels are our daily bread. So it becomes difficult. And I think for me, I can also sympathize to an extent, now being someone who's never been to any international conference or a COP. I can sympathize with that feeling of not necessarily always feeling like you can do something or that you can engage these areas around justice more effectively. And I find that sometimes, and what I found interesting when you're speaking was how sometimes some of these countries actually have like a host of negotiators. So one person can only follow negotiations under policy, and another one is talking about food security. And yet you come back to our context, and it's that one person who needs to be in 7 rooms at the same time and then having to prioritize. And when they do that prioritizing, they're leaving their voice outside of other rooms, where, again, it's like a reflection on some of the lack of resources that we have. And I don't always think that it's a lack of effort on the different governments' part. I think, again, like you said, that's just how the system has been structured to keep people out. And that's just a fact, right? And you find then that people are fighting so hard, be it in civil society, be it other African countries, to be at the table, having the same conversations. But with these negotiations, then still having that power imbalance where you are negotiating, but maybe it's a dead end because you are negotiating with people who are set on things. So then it's not really a negotiation, right? It's more like a convincing. I'm trying to convince you to maybe see my side and maybe hear me out. But maybe if you make a promise that next year when we come back, you're going to hear me out, then, so I think that's very, very interesting. And it does give us, I don't want to say black and white because it's not so easy, but it does give us kind of like a contrasting view between what can be viewed as justice, the fact that more people can actually attend these workshops, but also the fact that even when people do attend, there's still all of these barriers that don't always allow them to fully engage. And so I want to come to Zahir and some of your experiences at or in international spaces rather, and not just COP, because I think, again, like COP is just very broad and I think it's more popular. But I also know that you've engaged in different spaces and how those spaces have been either similar or different from COP, and what value some of those spaces have offered. So, I mean, you are free to get into like, the specifics. I attended this and that, but also you can just be broad with it and say, these are some of the things that I think valuable, especially for activists, because sometimes I don't want to say we're so disconnected from the international arena, but sometimes we don't always have access to be in those same spaces. And so we really focus on what we're doing on the ground. So coming back to the question, because I also tend to do that, coming back to the question, what would you say are some of the, I don't want to use the word takeaway, but something of the sort. So what are some of the things that you've been able to look at and actually admire and maybe want to see more of in other international spaces, particularly on these issues around climate justice, climate change, and broader justice?
Yeah, that's a very, also one of these like complex, open-ended questions, but I love it because it enables the place for discussion and for introspection in that sense. I think based off of my experience, so based off of my international experience, I think I've mostly only really participated within the COP spaces, and I have been in different situations of international conferences or like the one from a more youth perspective. But I think the one thing that I want to say, and I'll now touch on each one individually, but more broadly, and I love the fact that I can say this, but one of the big takeaways is the power of youth. In all of my experiences in every single conference that I've attended, whether it is a Model UN conference, whether it is something in association with one of the United Nations bodies or UNICEF or UNESCO, or whether it is COP, the power of youth is the biggest takeaway. And I'm not sure if that is necessarily a bias, being that I am a young person myself, being that I find myself, as young people, we like coagulate around each other. There's always a way that we find a way to like be around each other. But the power of youth in these spaces is remarkable. And when looking and, tying back into Tyler's answer about justice, or even back to what I was saying about connecting these on the ground activists to the high level politicians, young people, especially in this generation, especially in this day and era, we are tired. And we have that energy, we have that radicalization, we have that understanding to be able to really push for change. And no matter whichever space it is, you can really see the dissonant disconnect between what they want versus what young people want. When you look at, and I'll touch on COP28 as my first example, only for the mere fact that I think there was a really big outcome there, in the fact that youth processes within COP27 and COP28, youth processes were formalized for the first time ever. Young people are getting their own pavilion at COP. Young people are part of the biggest audiences. Young people are able to cause commotion in the nicest way possible, cause commotion to be able to get these audiences. And because of that, processes have been formalized to get youth delegates on every country's delegation that was started in COP27, and get young people their own pavilion. And in COP28, there was a formalization of the youth presidency climate champion. So now there will be a young person on every single COP presidency to be able to filter in and bring in those views of young people. When I look at more on the educational perspective and look at the Model UN perspective in that international space, where primarily I'm surrounded by young people, especially and I love this space because in a Model UN space, and the one that I work with for Immuna for the past 3-4 years now, it is young people that are acting within the United Nations system as if they are the government. And you can truly see how they think and how they operate and what sort of objectives that they want and the types of resolutions that they're drafting. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, you always see the same inequalities wherever you go, regardless of COP or not COP. And I think, yes, there are spaces where countries have an equal vote or where participants have an equal vote, but it is a very clear line that is drawn between participants of the global south and participants of the global north, regardless of if you're a young person or not. Because the experiences, whilst young people from here are so radical, whilst young people from there or here have the ideas, have the ambitions, have the innovations, their experiences and our experiences just do not align. And it really, as Tyler said, backs us into a corner, backs us into a system that has been created against us. And you really, even still as a young person, as connected as we are, as globalization has taken over, as much as we can try to reach out to the empathy and the sympathy of other fellow young people, the objectives that are still there and the outcomes that come from all of these different spaces are still very self-serving to those countries, very self-serving to those delegates, very self-serving to the opportunities that they need for themselves. And when you look at, like, in this Model UN space, the accommodations, the sort of participation, the rules and requirements for what happens with delegates from the global south versus delegates from the global north, language barriers, financial barriers, the expectations of what they should do versus what we should do is still apparent. And I think it is sobering, it is harsh, but it is not necessarily a sign to give up, or it's not necessarily a sign to take it as it is. Like I said, when we look at these different conferences, And starting off my answer very positively and very confidently of the power of young people and how remarkable it is, we are unwavering. And these outcomes and objectives, as a small crumb as they are, we talk about, like, you go on these websites and it's like COP28 achieved this conference achieved this, UNESCO achieved this. We get a small crumb of that. And as small as that crumb might be, it is the sign that we should not be giving up. It is that we're working hard for what we're trying to do. And those outcomes and objectives are working in our favor where they can, and where we can bring them back and where we can implement them and where we can work together. Those will contribute and progress our actions towards climate justice and economic justice and gender justice. It is just a very long and hard battle. The objectives are breadcrumbs every year. But if anything, it is that young people, we take it as it comes and we move. To put it very plainly, we move and we will not stop. I hope that answers your question.
I mean, it certainly does. And I think also that encouragement for us to keep moving is very needed. Because we've only started the year, it's only end of February, and I feel like the year has gone with us. I feel like it's June. And that says a lot for someone who's also in the activist space. But I think just before I move on to Tala, just coming back to you, Zahir, I mean, you don't really have to go into it, but if you'd like, you can. Do you feel like it would make a difference if these conferences were maybe held on our home ground? So if we had, because I do know, okay, I see a lot of nods. Okay, I'm going to give you both a chance to please tell me why you think so. Because I do know that a couple of years ago, maybe about a decade ago, one of the COPs was hosted in Durban. And that's where we really saw the rise of some of the people that we quite like in the climate space. And when we speak about the people in power, it's not very often that you hear that. But I mean, using just South Africa as an example, a couple of years ago, one of these international conferences was hosted on our home ground. And I don't think I might be wrong. There might be someone older in the room, but I think I was probably in primary school at the time. So there's no way I could have engaged with it. But yeah, I mean, from what I hear, it was very good. It was very successful, and it allowed us to be on higher ground from a leveraging perspective. And when I say us, I really do mean the continent, because it was on our own ground. And so do you feel like this would make, especially considering what we know about some of these international conferences being intentionally set in inaccessible areas where they might not be the friendliest to activists, they might not be the friendliest to young people engaging with work or challenging authority? Would it make a difference, not just for young people, but I think for countries across the continent, for these international conferences to come back onto our soil? Also, just not wanting to negate the fact that Egypt is also in Africa. But yes, I mean, that is the question. And I'll start with you, Zahir, and then I'll move over to Tala.
Yeah, no, fantastic question. And you can clearly see Tyler and I are very passionate about this. This is the conversations that we have when we're sitting at the table after a long day of negotiations. And we're talking about the accessibility of COP, because if COP is many things, but the one thing is that it's not and bringing that back home, bringing them back to African soil or to global South soil would do wonders in terms of participation, in terms of accessibility, in terms of how that COP looks like. When COPs are selected, the country that is hosting it also forms part of the presidency. And the presidency, in theory, is just supposed to be a chair of debate, but they have a lot of power and influence over the agenda. They have a lot of power and influence over what passes, what does not pass, what gets discussed, who discusses it, who leads that negotiation, to the point where there was even an article that came out, and there was a scenario that happened at COP28 where the leaders from the small island developing states were actually left out of the room when the voting happened on one of the final resolutions. Bringing them back home to our own soil, to accessible parts of the world, would not only increase our presence of negotiators, and as we touched on earlier, where Global North have negotiators for every single stream, whereas Global South has one for many. We would not only be able to get negotiators for all streams, we'd be able to get activist representation. We'd be able to get NGO representation. We'd be able to get the general public to be involved. It would having a COP president that is from a Global South nation, or in particular an African nation or a sub-Saharan African nation, would be able to have a lot of power and influence as the COP president over what issues get discussed and who's discussing that. When COPs are in these remote parts of the world, when COPs are far away, when COPs are planned for Azerbaijan and we don't really know how we're going to get to Azerbaijan, it creates those immense barriers. Yes, it creates barriers for activists, but it creates barriers for everyone, in the sense that, like we spoke about governments and funding, which at the end of the day is public funding, but also the activists and the activist representation. COP is an expensive trip. It is not fun and games. And every time you breathe and every time you walk into that venue, you are sacrificing so much to be there. And for many that are young people, it's their education, it's their studies. For those that are working, for those that are with families, for those that are very passionate activists that have all of these different ideas that they are vocal about, all of that gets sacrificed because of badge restrictions. Funding restrictions, sometimes both. Many activists will get the badge, but then no funding. Many will get funding, but then no badge. Many have to find different solutions. And we have, like, it's a very common rhetoric, but like, okay, I will sleep on the floor as long as we get to be that COP. And it's a very common rhetoric amongst the activists. Like, okay, it's fine. We'll do it so long as we can get into that space. And that is no way to be in that space, to be able to communicate with others, to connect with others, and to be able to use that platform in the best way possible. So bringing that back home would do wonders. I'll pause there, and I'm sure Tyler will echo the same sentiments, but also add her insights as well.
So without adding too much, Tyler, please go ahead.
Thanks, and thanks here. I think that was a really great answer. And I think while you were talking, I was also thinking, well, yes, we absolutely do need to bring it back. So I think maybe let me start with the negative and then build up to the positive side. Is that it was either in a webinar I was in yesterday or today that I've heard a reflection from someone from being at the COP space in Dubai, which is this shiny city. If you like shiny and you like gloss, you'll love it. But at the same time, there's this huge, on your way to the COP venue, there's this huge oil or gas refinery. The air is so polluted. And then we're going to this climate change conference to stop this, when, like, it's very apparent that that's happening, but we're not talking about that. So there's that aspect of it. But then at the same time, so this reflection that someone had is like, to their governments, well, why do we need to not take out our oil and gas? Because look what it's done for the UAE. Look at Dubai. It's nice and shiny. They're rich. Like, we can be rich too if we do the exact same thing. So I think we do need to be very wary of that logic and that rhetoric in Africa and in the global south in general, making sure that, no, actually, we're not going to get rich by extracting our resources, because where are those resources going at the end of the day anyway? To the north. And that idea of, as you started mentioning earlier, Michelle, the transition fuels, and gas as a transition fuel. At the end of the day, it's Africa that's going to be stuck with that infrastructure. We're going to have the stranded assets. We're going to put all this money and get a huge amount of debt to invest in this infrastructure to get gas going and use it as a transition fuel. But it's a transition fuel for Europe because the Ukraine-Russia crisis stopped their oil line. So they need it as a backup. We don't need it. We've got solar, we've got wind, we've got the resources we need to go renewable. But because Europe needs it, that rhetoric is being driven forward. And so we do have to be careful of how those dynamics are coming at play, and how they're also coming at play nationally and with national groups. Like an example of what we saw in the African Climate Week, it was basically co-opted by a consulting firm, McKinsey, and the agenda was driven by them. It wasn't necessarily an African agenda. The declaration more so became an African declaration, but the agenda of the program wasn't necessarily. So that's kind of the negative. There are caveats of bringing it home, is that there are these dynamics. Our countries are in significant debt. We owe a lot of money. We don't have much power. We're fighting a system that keeps finding ways to fight us back and disempower us as a country and as people. But on the good side, the next COP after, so it's a conversation we've been having within the climate justice movement alongside trade unions, gender justice groups, farmers, peasant people, all these sort of groupings is, yes, we acknowledge the next COP is going to be in another petro state and not necessarily going to be easy to interact with as a civil society. But how do we build up towards the one after that, which is going to be in Brazil, which is a country that's both facing hectic amounts of deforestation, but also kind of trying to rein it back in at the same time as trying to grow their economy. And yeah, there's still earth and human rights defenders getting attacked and killed. And then you have before that, you have the biodiversity COP happening later this year in Colombia. So how do you kind of need to connect the dots, and how do we as a movement support people on the ground in the countries that are experiencing these things? How do we actually make sure their voices are heard? And so it's kind of have them, one, inside the room, but two, on the outside, really mobilize people. And how do we get, like we saw the Fridays for Future strikes? I feel like from my personal perspective, that's young people really showing our power before because I joined the youth climate movement before it was really the youth climate movement that everyone recognizes and can recognize, oh, young people engaging in climate policy or climate politics, that's normal, because now it is normal. But before then it was like, what voice do you have? Who are you to come and say you can talk about policy? Like, what do you know? You're young, you don't know anything, kind of thing. That was kind of the rhetoric you met with. And so what we have seen is that it's become a lot more popular and a lot more recognized that young people actually do have a say, and they do have important things to say. They're living the experience. We're going to be the generation that every other year we're going to have, or people we know are going to experience a climate disaster. Like if you look at probably the people on this call, how many of us have either experienced a flood, a drought, experiencing a heat wave right now in Cape Town? How many of us have experienced such an event? Or how many of us know someone who has lost some of their livelihoods, not being able to go to work, lost housing, lost their livelihoods basically because of a climate disaster? And so more and more we're going to be experiencing the effects, and not only just directly, we're going to be experiencing the effects of rising fuel prices because of the transition need, and we can't afford electric vehicles. But then also electric vehicles are based on further extraction of resources, and those resources are all going to the same place I've mentioned before. So how do we connect these dots? And I think a big part of realizing how it affects us and comes back to us is really a part of building the power of young people, is we know the life our parents lived, and the climate conditions and the economic conditions they faced. We're going to face a completely different set, maybe sometimes related and also backed by the same system that especially South Africa has created, the apartheid system, and how we deal with it and correct that and the injustices we still face because of bad spatial planning and racist spatial planning. How does that still affect people today, both in dealing with the day-to-day living, but also the climate crisis? And how does, because of spatial planning as it was, how does that make people more prone to, one, having to walk further for water, not having actual service delivery such as water? Or how does it affect their proneness to fires, droughts, floods, all these sorts of things? And yeah, so coming background, I think there's a big importance of having it in a space where voices aren't repressed, they're not pushed back, people can speak up, that we can really have a moment of going, wow, this is what is happening. Because we saw, even though the UK is global north country, not great at a lot of things, still investing in oil and gas, offshore and onshore, and coal. But at the same time, the regime itself in the country, although they're taking a step back and blocking the ability for protesters to actually protest, and we're seeing that a lot now, as well as the case of Palestine, of a lot of countries using that as an excuse to remove rights of public demonstration. But the power we can do and the pressure that creates, having a huge amount of voices on the outside demanding something, really changes the pressure. And I think a good example is 3-4 years ago, the loss and damage negotiations were only limited to it being a network, the Santiago network. But now we have a fund, albeit very little money and literal peanuts were added to the fund, but we have a fund. And so if we look at that from a broader perspective, that was a lot of people and a lot of movements putting so much pressure on the international system and calling it out, doing op-eds, doing the media work, doing the actions on the ground, highlighting these solutions, releasing publications. Because of that, it put pressure that this loss and damage fund finally got established. So how do we look at doing that for, say, like the just transition work? We know that for the G77 coming out of COP28, we know this year the COP29 theme is going to mostly be on finance, because they're currently working towards the new quantified collective goal on finance, and there's still discussions of, is there actually going to be a number on how much finance is needed? Because historically, maybe kind of going back to one of our earlier questions on justice, historically, governments in the global south have gone to these negotiations on good faith. There will be support. There'll be technology transfer, there'll be capacity support, and there'll be a means of implementation, i.e. finance. And there was this agreement back in 2009 of $100 billion every year. It then became $100 billion by XY year. That doesn't even meet the needs of what is needed to act on climate change. And so there's now this process to come up with like a quantified goal. And there was talk up for the past couple months to years of there isn't actually going to be a number. So I think that's something we need to keep pressure on for this year. And then moving forward into COP30 is, how do we make sure we get that just transition framework much broader than only focusing on only on energy, and only what work is in the energy industry? How do we make sure it's for all of society and all of the people that are going to be experiencing this transition as we move from a carbon-based society to a decarbonized society, but also taking into account human rights, social justice, human welfare, education, all these other priorities that we have. So I know I answered probably a lot more broader than the question you've asked, and taken it to the next steps. But the importance of being able to build a movement around a moment and around a country that allows us to do things and say things and speak out and not be attacked for saying those things is incredibly important for actually getting our voices heard and out there.
Oh, and I think you both said very valuable things. And I almost want to engage with a lot of what you guys both said, but I also feel like I might be taking away from a lot of the value that you both provided. And just bringing people's minds back to like the topic around, are there viable alternatives? And I think what we've been hearing throughout this whole conversation is this need for alternatives and what those alternatives could potentially even look like. So I really quite appreciate that. In both of your engagement that's coming up very strongly, especially now with this issue of young people and involvement in access and bringing it back to level ground or higher ground for us. But yes, I like that Hopotso has started, because that's exactly what we're going to move into. We're going to move into a Q&A with our panelists, and we are going to be asking or directing some of these questions to either of you. And then soon after that, I want to come to the space where we maybe start talking about evaluating climate solutions. So technical feasibility, like we heard now with the Just Transition Framework and with this money that was promised, and with this access, with all of these things that we keep engaging with and maybe even signing. So that's kind of where, just to prepare everyone's mind, that's kind of where the conversation is going to go. So toward the end, we really want to look at what these climate solutions, well, their feasibility specifically, and implementation as well. And then how do we track success? How do we measure success? How do we then say that, you know, because we're committed to all of these things, this is what we have been able to do. And so this is why we're successful. Okay, so with that said, Hopotso has a question. How are the governments held accountable to deliver their promises? How is corruption mitigated? And, okay. A part of me wants to be like, maybe not right now, but then part of me knows that we actually have to go into it now. So I'll start with you, Thala, and then we'll move to Zahir.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And basically it comes back to, we have the Paris Agreement. It's been said to be legally binding. But at the end of the day, there's no international police that will enforce this. Not that the policing system is great for many people anyway, but there's no legally enforceable way of enforcing the Paris Agreement, of holding a country accountable. You signed on to it, what are you doing? But there's many buts in this conversation. While there might not be an international police, there's lots of avenues we can hold people and our government representatives accountable and hold corporations accountable. So there's that whole strand of climate litigation and taking, say, Shell, Total, all of the big oil refineries and producers, taking them to court, and basically ensuring they do the divestment from oil and gas. But at the same time, there's quite a significant example from the Niger Delta where I think it's Shell has left and basically kind of sold off the assets and the resources to the local communities. But now they have stranded assets because they can't actually do anything and use those resources because it's now against the government's climate commitments and priorities. And also generally not a great idea for the communities at stake and the pollution that they're going to experience and the health impacts they're going to experience. So yeah, quite a difficult question. How do you hold them accountable and how do you stop corruption? It's basically making sure we're keeping it on the conversation, remembering the pact. So there's a lot of things, maybe something we haven't discussed is there's a lot of things that get negotiated and ruled out in the rooms where every country has a say and at COP. And then there's also stuff that happens on the side where they call it a pact, where basically countries sign up. We like what you're saying. We want to sign up to that pact. And there was quite a number of countries in COP26 that signed up to like kind of divest from oil and gas and move away from it. And there's a lot of pressure from civil society movements and groups to say, hey, you made this commitment, like you need to stick to it. And keeping that pressure both by doing reports, following up, checking the numbers, crunching the numbers, and also taking governments to court and questioning them when they're implementing both the national climate policies and say like the NDCs that are coming up, the next cycle for review. So there's lots of ways we can hold them accountable, but being a participant and raising these questions when you're in the spaces with government is quite important and quite essential to making sure it does stay on the agenda and things do stay transparent and people do stay accountable.
Cool. Thanks a lot for that. Zahir, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have much more to add. I think it was a very insightful answer from Tyler, and when broken down, I love the reference that Tyler made in that there's no international police, and it is a very unfortunate, but we sit in that situation where a lot of the accountability has to fall on us, has to fall on the public, has to fall on the NGO space, has to fall on those that can keep our politicians in line, can keep our representatives in line. And it is unfortunate, and yet it is still the case. I will stop there so we can give room for more questions.
I only see one other one. And then just in the interest of time, if you do still have a question, please pop it in the chat. Our panelists can see it. I also saw them engaging with the chat earlier. So the next one is from Masejo, who says, thank you both for unapologetically being present on the ground and for mobilizing youth voices in the climate change space. You're both phenomenal. The question that I would like to ask is, what is the reason for COP not prioritizing the voices of children and community members at COP? Especially in panel discussions as they bear the brunt of climate-related disasters and have the potential of providing solutions to the issues they endure on a daily basis. So I'll start with you and then we'll move on to Tyler.
Yeah, no, thank you, Masejo. I really appreciate the kind words, and it means a lot, especially in the space that we are, and especially how depressing COP is, as you can tell. When it comes to the voices of children and those that are most vulnerable, it's complicated. And I suppose every answer we've been given, we've been saying it's complicated. So I apologize for the repetitiveness, but it really is. I think it comes down to some large factors. And I think the first one is just accessibility, in that children, most vulnerable, youth, at the end of the day, in most cases, school-age children, school-going children, those that may come from different extenuating circumstances, those that come from socioeconomic circumstances that put them in different aspects of life and put them in different phases of life. COP is inaccessible for them. And for many that are under the age of 18, being still a minor, having to get representation and get a badge and funding for not only them, but for a parent or guardian or a chaperone of some sorts is extremely, it's a difficult process. And I've even had encounters with this of specifically young children that I've met that get badges and they have their projects, they have the representation that they need, but they're unable to attend because of different factors that make COP in itself inaccessible. When it comes to these sort of webinars and panel discussions and things that are a little bit more catering to an online audience, as remarkable as young people are, and as the pathway is being paved, there is a very big underestimation of young people, and it is unfortunate. And you sit in the room being the youngest person, sometimes being more knowledgeable, in fact most of the times being more knowledgeable, having more lived experience, being able to truly reflect on climate action and climate justice, but you are severely underestimated in that aspect. And whilst I was confidently saying that young people are making that movement, it is true, we are seeing that. COP27 had a very large youth audience, and COP28 even larger, creating a significant chunk of the active participants that were at COP, those that were protesting, those that were inside in the negotiation rooms, those under the age of 18 that were able to get access. There is still that very big underestimation. And I suppose, fortunately, in the context of South Africa, we were given the opportunity to have a voice. As small of a voice that was, we were given the opportunity to have a seat at the table. But in many instances and in many countries, that is not the case. Young people are underestimated. They are perceived as not having that knowledge, not having that experience. And when it comes down to it, it's inaccessibility issues, it's accessibility issues, or it's issues of underestimation or lack of experience for that matter. Yeah, and I think I can pause my answer there. We can go a lot more in depth into this, but yeah, I'll pause there.
Well, thanks, Tana.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, really great answers here. I think maybe to take it a step further on the like the misunderstanding of youth and like that they don't recognize that we have the knowledge. It's just like kind of the fear of young people and what they're going to say and how they're going to speak up. So my personal experience, back in 2019, there was a Partnership for Action on the UN Partnership for Action on the Green Economy Conference that happened here in Cape Town. And there was a delegation of young people that were invited to attend. And so initially we'd been informed, okay, you guys are there to be part of the panel discussions, observe the event, like join in. We got there and one of the people from the department or one of the organizers basically said, you guys are here to be ushers, like nothing more. Like you can't engage in the sessions, basically. You're just here to usher and you're just here to show people where they go. And we're like, well, that's not what we were told. Like we're allowed to be here. So basically, we did a lot of using social media, a lot of talking to people on the sidelines. I think social media at that point was the biggest pressure. We kept using hashtag youth voice not heard, youth are leading, and adding all the panelists in sessions where they would bring up youth and be like, you're talking about youth, we're here, come talk to us. And they did, and it got us invited into one panel. But their specific reflection of this event was basically, we prepared a youth statement and like a declaration of this is what we want to see happening on the green economy. And we then got the opportunity to record a video of the statement. And basically the organizers then decided they have space to show the video and screen the video, but the video wasn't going to be done yet. We'd just given our like audio and visual, and the editing team still had to put it together. So there was time for the video to run, but there wasn't time for us to stand up and read our declaration. So this was like at the emergence of Greta coming up, and I think a lot of people being scared of what are young people going to say once they actually have the mic. But there was quite a lot of fear of like, how much are we actually going to call them out? Because governments and leaders don't like being called out. It makes them incredibly uncomfortable when you tell them they're not doing their job and they're just talking nonsense. So there's kind of that aspect of fearing young people in public platforms. And then there's the aspect of inside the negotiation rooms. The understanding and logic is that young people should be represented by their governments, and that they should represent the interests of all their populations. The caveat then is young people don't have the power to vote. So if you have not registered to vote and you're South African, shame on you. I hope anyone that's South African, and also there's a lot of African countries going to the polls this year. So make sure to check that out and exercise your power if you are of the legal voting age. But basically, going back to my point, young people have a significant disadvantage and they don't choose who their leaders are. They trust in their grandparents and their parents, maybe even great-grandparents, to choose who the leaders are. And they trust in their parents to hold them accountable, because who are you as like a grade 7, 12, 13-year-old kid to come up with these solutions and come up with these ideas and have a voice when even your parents don't have a voice? So it's kind of that dynamic. But at the same time, there's trust in the system that those voices are represented. And that's why in the negotiation rooms, young people don't have a seat. The logic is then it's very flawed, and I don't agree with it. Like, if it was up to me, young people in the constituencies would have a seat and they would be able to veto and stand up against things that are getting put in place, because the reality is there's a lot of things and decisions being made for us without us. And so in the negotiation rooms, a lot of the time, young people can sit behind the younger banner, the youth NGOs banner of the UNFCCC constituency. But as Zahir said, there's also quite a big divide between Global North youth and Global South youth. So it's making sure, how do our voices filter in there? And so it's also not always guaranteed, once you do make an intervention in the negotiation rooms, oh, the young person has spoken, yay for the young person speaking. They don't care what you said as a young person, just the fact you said it. So there's so many barriers to it. And then maybe to end this all off is there's lots of bad things and there's lots of good things, and there's a lot of hope for young people. And I'd say continually fighting, us as youth activists, when we do have a space to engage with government, it's on us to make sure that space remains for someone else that is younger than me, and maybe less knowledgeable and experienced in this process, to still have that seat and be able to occupy that seat when I leave. There needs to be some sort of institutional memory to make sure that once I leave, as we've done, as I've left, as Zahir has left, certain spaces, is how do we make sure there's another voice there to occupy that space and really represent people and make sure more voices come in. And something that we have seen, and it has been a good win, and it's not across the board and not all organizations and youth groups have experienced this. There is a lot to be said about privilege in organizations and your relationships with government and who they like and who they don't like. That's another dynamic in itself. But making sure that those voices can be heard and that you bring those in. And so one of the big wins we have had is that we're able to go as a youth delegate for the country and able to actually sit behind the South African flag and speak on their behalf. Are we ready to speak on their behalf? Maybe that's another question. But the fact we do have the power to do that is incredible. And the fact that when a couple of years ago, I think it was COP26 as well, is when I was sitting behind on the gender negotiations behind the South African flag, and we're working with the South African negotiator, one of them, on developing South Africa's positioning on it. They're like, well, what did you guys say as youth? And they basically copy pasted, okay, cool, that's South Africa's positioning. So we're seeing that a lot more. And it's also building through a lot of trust of the people that do go and do get to represent this, however many million of young people in the country, is making sure that we do that justice ourselves so that we continually be invited, and that it might not be me next year, but it's going to be Zahir, and after Zahir, it's going to be Michelle, and after Michelle, it's going to be someone else. So how do we make sure that keeps on happening? And that's really how we keep the young voice in the space and actually heard.
Wonderful. I think excellent questions, excellent answers from both of you. And even the questions inside are making me think, should this have been part of the questions as well? But we only have an hour and a half. And what I want to do, just for the sake of time, is not so much engage with everything that you guys have said, and kind of sadly pause some of the Q&A here, and still saying that is ask afterwards. Like, we have their contact details. So if you have any specific questions, you can let us know, and then we'll send them off to our panelists. And that's three things that I'm tempted to bunch as one, just in terms of the question. And you'll bear with me, just because we have about 10 minutes left, and about 2 of those minutes I need to do some admin things. So, like I mentioned earlier, I really wanted to get into sort of this space where we start to evaluate these alternative or these climate solutions, and specifically focusing on these three areas, one being technical feasibility. So when we speak about these things, when we're at international conferences and we're talking about solutions that may be technical, are they feasible, specifically for our African context? But I also feel like, in part, that question has been somewhat answered when we're speaking about these transition fuels and how we are going to be stuck with a lot of the infrastructure, because we'd have done a lot of the extraction. And once we've done that, we've sold it off elsewhere, and then we're going to be stuck. So the feasibility there for Africa, really, for me personally, I'm not hearing that it's there. And maybe that is the opinion that both of you hold. And I mean, it's only 3 of us who agree on one thing. So I'm wanting to say that that is something that I think we've addressed. But now going on to this idea of long-term implementation, as well as measuring the success of the things that we would have implemented. So I think what I'm going to do is that first part, you're more than welcome to touch on. But what I really want to hear is those 2 things where we decide on a long-term implementation plan of something that we obviously view as feasible for Africa. And then how then are we going to be able to measure that that thing was successful, right? So the question then becomes, or the bunched up question becomes, and please bear with me, because when we start speaking about these, or when we continue to speak about these international conferences, trying to address these challenges around climate solutions, specific tangible solutions, and solutions around justice, how can we put ourselves in a space where we can address long implementation strategies? And I think a part of this also came up when either of you were speaking about how these dates keep being moved. So we're implementing this $100 billion, and then actually we're not, because now we're saying by this time, and then we push it, and then we push it. So long-term implementation really isn't there. It becomes a thing of the past. And so second part then becoming, fine, we've now finally come together and agreed that this is what we're going to do. And let's now assume that 190 plus countries of the world agree, and that we're finally going to do it. Now, from an African perspective, how then can we actually measure, and this being very broad, because I haven't given you anything tangible to actually assess, but how can we measure the success of some of these implementation plans? And I'll start with Zahir, and then we'll go to Tyler, and we'll see what time allows us to do after.
That is such a big question. I bared with you, and I bared with you, and I bared with you. Let's see, and let's get into it. I think something that is so, that's me again, something that is so difficult that we struggle with in every single space, as long as Tyler and I'm speaking on behalf of both of us here because she's going to agree, but as long as we've been in the space and we've been raising our voice and we've been creating policy and we've had a seat at the table, implementation, long-term implementation, and monitoring and evaluation of that effectiveness is the most difficult thing. It is something so intangible, not sure the word. It is something so intangible and so vague and broad, in the sense that what really is effective implementation? Who is effective implementation meant for? How do we break that down into the different socioeconomic and geopolitical groups of each country, of each state/province, of each city, of each local municipality, considering how different they are? So briefly touching on like the feasibility, you're absolutely right. Are any of these solutions feasible? No. No, with a but. They are not feasible. They are, like we've said, they are created in a system that is completely backed against us. there are always room for improvement. There's always room for hope. There's always room for what's next and what's coming. And yet there's also always this delay and delay and delay. And how can we achieve better? And specifically, I want to use an anecdote of an example at COP28, where if you look at any of the headlines that come out of it, it is, oh, wow, COP28 is the first COP to initiate the phase out of fossil fuels, or the phase down of fossil fuels. And I'm specifically saying that word phase down of fossil fuels, when in reality, at the start of the conference, all of the resolutions were about the phase out. All of the resolutions were about this complete removal of fossil fuels. So we'd actually started there, and all of the global south and everyone had lost their position in that. So what had happened was we walk out with this resolution that says phase transition away, as Tyler's correcting me, a transition away of fossil fuels. And we've completely lost our entire position as the global south. And that resolution and that solution that was supposed to be feasible for us is now lost. And yet the way that the world reads it is, oh, we've made this big leap and we're going to transition away from fossil fuels, when in reality we started off with a phase out. That was the first resolution, that was the first draft resolution, and we had completely lost our positioning. If in the hypothetical scenario the 193 countries come together to agree, how do we look at long-term implementation and monitoring and determining the effectiveness of that? I think it really does come down to the socioeconomic and, unfortunately, the political state of the country. Because it is so easy to get your negotiators there to put all of the people politics and the party politics behind and to come to a resolution. And I think when you're there, as COP is also a very human experience in the fact that you are one human connecting to another human and you're having that conversation. And yes, you are representing your country, so you do have that barrier in front of you, and especially if you're a global north versus a global south. But at the end of the day, you are in that interpersonal connection, and you are trying to be able to, like Tyler said, convince each other and have this sort of resolution where we can find an agreement. And you're laughing with each other, and you're meeting in the hallways, and you're trying to get to a conclusion. And then you come back and the resolutions that are passed at COP are then not agreed on by the government of the country. Are they not agreed or implemented by the government? Are they not agreed on by the different parties or stakeholders in that space? Or not agreed upon by the municipalities, the local municipalities? And it becomes that you get to see that hierarchy of something that was made a resolution there at COP and then that implementation down here. And suddenly not everybody's agreeing in that process. Not everybody's able to see that long-term implementation plan. So what it relies on is it truly relies on the power of the people in electing representatives, in community-driven action, in driving those processes, because the UN and COP will drive it from a top-down approach, but we need to see that bottom-up approach from people and from everyday people as well, so we can get that action and we can sort of develop those plans and see that synergy of municipality, of people, of the UN, of government, etc. And then on monitoring it and determining if it's effective, I think, again, we're asking too many difficult questions here. And I think it is, like I said, it comes down to those questions of what do we deem is effective? What do we deem is what works for one might not work for the other. And even if we have these long-term plans, we've got a legally binding resolution. We've got a long-term plan for Africa. It's been passed by all of the governments. It's been tabled at the African Union. It's been tabled at all of the national assemblies. Then we get to, okay, it's being implemented. What is it? How is it being implemented? Who is involved in that process? And a big example of this is the just energy transition. And we call it the just energy transition, but is it really just? Who are we involving in that process? And Tyler's nodding no, because it's and that is an example, right? The just energy transition, and Tyler will talk more about this, but like, you know, that plan of the 8.5 billion, that's now 11.5 billion, passed in the UN, came down to the South African government, passed by the South African government, was looked upon favorably. Where's it? Where's it going? Who's involved? It's a just energy transition, and those that are affected most and those that are most vulnerable are not necessarily playing their part, or not. I shouldn't even word it like that. My apologies. Are not being given the space to play their part. They're not being given the opportunity to develop and to come up with answers that are, this is what we deem effective. We are the most vulnerable. We are the ones that are suffering. This is what we deem as effective, not what you deem as effective. And how do we get there? And I think determining that effectiveness relies on once again, community-driven action on the people of that are facing these issues, because it is really them that would need to see this effectiveness. I hope I've been able to answer everything that was in that big and loaded question. I think I will speak more broadly in general, but yeah, I'll pass it to Tyler, who will probably provide insight there as well.
Thanks, Ahir. Yeah, I think you gave a really great question, and I don't know how much more I can add to it because it is one of those. Another question, Michelle, you're asking us very hard questions today, very complex, that you can write whole theses on these questions and the answers in themselves. But kind of, I want to take it back to the technical feasibility and what Zahir was saying on the language, is that yes, we finally got the words fossil fuel in the language. But yes, as Zahir pointed out, they say transition away from. And then once again, we got the language after that of gas as a transition fuel. Let's use CCS, geoengineering, solar radiation management, carbon offsets. Let's go ahead for carbon markets, kind of all in the same vein, which means basically let's do nothing. Let's continue doing fossil fuels, but let's do stuff on the side to mitigate it. And let's do stuff and use technology to set it off. At the same time, renewables are great and they're providing access. But when we're deploying renewables, we have to be doing it in the mindset of, one, they're providing access. And two, when we're doing renewables, we're not just adding extra energy capacity. We're reducing the usage of fossil fuels at the same time. We can't have one go up and the other still continue, because it's just like, okay, the demand keeps going. And that rhetoric that demand needs to keep growing, that's especially coming from the global north. We kind of need to tackle that narrative, because yes, demand should grow in some countries and some places. Africa, it will grow, because naturally Africa is still growing and there's a lot of people without access. But in the global north, so many people have access and have too much usage. We need to drive that down. So on the technical side of things, they are feasible, but at the same time, they're not fundable. And the real solutions are the hardest things. So when you're looking at mitigation, I was in a call early on blended finance, or on a webinar early on blended finance. And when you're looking at how climate finance and where the money goes, the majority of it goes to mitigation, which is what I've said is, one, renewables, and two, what a lot of governments are hailing as the Hail Mary, which isn't proved as like actually effective and actually proven at scale, of CCS and all these other full solutions. A lot of money is going to that. And because investors and people that are putting the money in can get return on that amount, it's high risk, high rewards kind of thing. I'm not an economist, but I can understand there's money to be made and we live in a capitalist society. So let's keep doing things that make us money. But there's no money and there's not enough money going to the real solutions, going to the adaptation, actually changing the way our cities work, the way we plan things. If you look at going, like what Zahir mentioned, and without going too much longer, on the Just Energy, the JET-P, and the framework, is the key focuses are on decarbonizing Eskom, which isn't enough money to fully do that. Looking at green hydrogen, which is basically an exportable form of energy that we can make money from, and looking at electric vehicles, which is only actually going to benefit individuals and private consumers and not the mass amount of people that need to be moved by transport. And it's not actually going to give us the decarbonization gain, because if we're looking at EVs, you're just going from internal combustion vehicles and people that can afford that to EVs. We're not going from 50 cars to one bus. We're going from 50 cars to another 50 different cars. And so there's so many other dynamics we can talk about. There's a lot of feasible things, but they're not really fundable. And there's a lot of things that should be funded, but in the eyes of investors, they're not feasible and they're not going to gain returns. And so looking at our long-term success and long-term implementation, it's difficult. How do we look at our impact as activists in this space? It's hard. You can't measure that. You can take the small wins as they come. You can take these small engagements with people, the conversations you have on the sideline, people saying, keep going, and really hope you make a dent in the system at some point, and that you change enough minds and opinions that we get to that future we envision that's not completely unlivable, and not only the rich can survive it and everyone else must suffer kind of place. But there's so much more we can unpack, but I know we're over time now, so I will leave it there.
Thanks, Tyler, and thanks, Zahir. Yeah, we are over time, and thank you so much to everyone who stayed and just been patient with us, because this is a very broad, packed conversation that I do think we can do a series on. This could have been episode 1. Unfortunately, I did not think that far ahead, and so for the purposes of today, we will chat. A massive thank you to both of you, not just for the work that you're doing, but also for being here and engaging with us. I always do this, and I would like to please request, if there's someone who's just joined us, to summarize your feeling, your thoughts, your standpoint in just one sentence. That's just one thing that someone can take away. So I'll give you both that opportunity. Let's try to do that in less than 30 seconds. If it can be done in 15 seconds, even better. But in just one sentence, a conclusion of some sort. I mean, again, wow us like you did in the beginning. So, but just with less time. Maybe I'll start with Tyler this time, and then Zahir to close us off. Tyler was not ready, and then we'll just go into the nitty-gritties and everything else that you guys need to know. So around data, around getting in touch with us, you'll find in the chat that you've got 2 email addresses. So if you want to speak to the education team, specifically myself and Tulu, you will email education@africanclimatealliance.org. For general African Climate Alliance inquiries, you'll have to email team@africanclimatealliance.org. Otherwise, visit us online. We have a website, africanclimatealliance.org. So I think I've given Tyler enough time to prepare. So please go ahead.
You're not letting me hear Zahir's answer and take a spin on it, so he gets to do that for me. But actually, conclusions. Basically, in one line, you can be hopeful, but be angry at the same time and channel that anger into doing something about it. We always say it shouldn't be on us, but at the end of the day, we are the ones taking action. And so we need to make sure that we're not doing it by ourselves. We're doing it with the community. And we're really able to build, as Zahir and I have both said, that people power, because we can't walk this walk alone. Being an activist is tiring, but walking that road with others makes it a lot easier and a lot better.
Thanks, Tyler. Zahir?
Okay, no pressure. In one sentence, I think I would echo the same things, but we are working in a system that was built against us, but that is not an opportunity to give up. That is not an opportunity to sit back and watch as things fold. As I've said before, youth are remarkable. We have this power, we have this connection, we have the globalization, and that is the strongest thing that's going to keep us going. And more personally, find your entry point into the space. Climate activism, climate justice, COP is not for those that are politicians only. It's not for those that have these extensive backgrounds, 10 years of experience. I'm a digital arts major. You can enter the climate space from any space that you deem fit, and you can create change and create positive change and really come together and share those skills and share those opportunities so that we can enact positive change in any way that we can and make a dent in the system, either from outside the walls in protest action or from inside the walls as delegates.
Thank you so much. And a massive thank you to you both for being incredible panelists, but also for being incredible at the work that you're both doing and just those unique perspectives that you offered on this conversation. I do acknowledge that it was very broad, and every single one of these questions has been broad, could have been a conversation by itself. So thank you so much for that. And we hope to see you again sometime in the future, engaging with us again on these matters.